Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I am very excited to have my next guest on the show. She is Dr. Meredith Moran, and she works a lot with first responders, but she has that unique background of being a Leo, former first responder, and now she is working as a clinician with her company, First Line Wellness. Welcome, Dr. Moran. Frontline Wellness. I'm sorry.
Frontline Wellness. Yeah.
I didn't have my readers on, Meredith.
That's okay. It's okay.
Frontline Wellness, folks. Welcome, Dr. Moran.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
So we talked a little bit before we started about, you have that law enforcement background, and every Leo or former Leo I have on the show, I always ask them the same thing, Meredith. I'm going to ask you, what made you become a cop? Why'd you want to do it?
It's weird. I don't know. I don't have a family background in law enforcement. I have two distant cousins that were cops back in the day.
Yeah.
But something clicked in my early teens, and I just said, I really want to do that. And I became a police explorer at the age of 15. I did that till I was 21 and went off to college and got my bachelor's degree in criminology. And then I ended up getting hired right back on in my later 20s, or at the age of 27, I got hired back on with the agency that I was an explorer with. So I think it was just that desire to help people,
mm-hmm.
but also it just seemed like a really cool thing to do.
And what you, and Meredith, I mean, there's highs and lows. In law enforcement. Well, what were some of you, if you'd be willing to share, what were some of the most difficult aspects that you had to deal with being in law enforcement?
Luckily for me, one of the easier aspects, there's always that talk about being a woman in law enforcement and a male dominated job. And I ended up with a really good department and a couple of really good FTOs that they focused on you as an officer.
Yeah.
So I didn't get a lot of that male female dynamic of, oh, she's not gonna perform because she's a woman.
Yeah, she's a woman.
Blah, blah, blah. I think some of the most difficult, one of my early calls was a shooting call between two kids that got hold of a gun. And that was an interesting one because it was like a Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting at my zone partner's house. She had just had some surgery and we're just chilling, and the alert tone goes off. And it's weird because instinctively I thought, oh, this is going to be my call, before they started even calling out numbers.
Sure.
And it's that going from 0 to 100 just like that. And then trying to figure out the call, it sounded like it was maybe a domestic to begin with.
In the midst of chaos and all that stuff.
Yeah. And then, going that super high. That was the day I learned what adrenaline really was and how it affects me. And that, I ended up having to go to the hospital, and I was there when he was the child was pronounced dead, and I had to wait with the body. And then it was like that adrenaline crash happened. And that and when I started teaching law enforcement recruits, I talked about this story because I really began to understand, what does adrenaline do to your body, and what does it do to my body? At the end of that call, and still with adrenaline, I get a screaming headache. It felt like a railroad tie was being smashed through the center of my skull. Luckily, we have a good CISM team, critical incident stress management team at the time. So we immediately had a CISM debriefing that night, which I think really helped. And we're did a lot with the family throughout the entire week. We ended up, myself and one of the other officers and the detectives went to the funeral. And so we did a lot of that with the family throughout the week. So that it didn't really bother me in that sense, but it was weird because when I would talk about it in front of an audience of police recruits, I would feel that adrenaline rush start to come up again. And I didn't really understand that until I got into the counseling field and started talking about the brain and how trauma affects our brains and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. What were some of the biggest highlights? I mean, we talked about the depressing stuff, the traumatic stuff that we can talk about in a little bit more in depth. But what were some of the highlights of your career? What made it, you were like, oh my God, this is why I got into it?
Yeah, I think those days when you helped people, those days when you would get a letter from some random stranger. I have a letter in my file of, it was pouring down rain, and this elderly woman, her car was kind of on the fritz, and I was like, okay, well, I'll follow you home to make sure you get home safely. And she wrote this great letter to the chief about, how kind I was and all of that. And I did a lot of work around domestic violence investigation at that time. My agency was one of the leaders in domestic violence investigation, and I helped start a program where people can turn in old cell phones and they get handed out to domestic violence victims and survivors so that they have access to 911. And I started that program in the early 90s, and it's still going on in some fashion. Wow. So those are the things that I'm really proud of, is when,
that's what keeps you going, Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps you going. I mean, so I know before we started, Doctor, you were telling me what your plan was initially, but what was and you can share that, but what was the catalyst that said, okay, I really want to get into the clinical part of it. I really want to start, doing the counseling and the therapy.
Yeah. So like I said before, my life plan at 15 was, I'm going to go to the academy. I'm going to work for local law enforcement for a little while. I'm going to be a Fed. And then when I retire, I'm going to teach at a university. That was the plan. And 6.5 years into my law enforcement career, I've never been what you would call a natural shooter. It's always something that I've always had to work at it.
Yeah.
And 6.5 years in, I got some really severe test anxiety, and I could not hit the broadside of a barn. I couldn't qualify if my life depended on it. Which is funny because they sent me to the psychiatrist, and he said, if this were a real shoot situation where her life did depend on it, I have no doubt that she would get the job done. This is strictly test anxiety.
Yeah. Some people are like that. I mean, it's
And so while I was kind of battling this, obviously they have to take your gun away. I was on the front desk, and that churned up a lot of self-doubt about, well, if I can't do this part of my job, how could I possibly continue to do this part of my job, even though the two things are separate?
Sure.
And so I ended up resigning at that point. But right around the same time that was happening, a colleague of mine died by suicide. So he had been in a shooting several years earlier and was kind of on a downward spiral. And he and I weren't that close, so I didn't see it. Other people did, but it was, kind of the mid 90s, and we didn't think about PTSD and first responders the way we do now. So a lot of stuff was missed. And I had actually talked to him 3 days before he killed himself. So those two things kind of happened right around the same time. I ended up landing a job at our local police academy as a training coordinator, and I was a faculty member at the same time. So it was kind of a no-brainer to go get a doctorate, because that's what you did as faculty. So I was like, let's go get a doctorate in counseling.
Yeah.
Not understanding the process that, of getting licensed. I'm like, I'll just go get a doctorate in counseling, and then I can be a counselor and help people. And
And then here you are.
And here I am. It took a long time. I was at the academy for about 8 years and then got laid off. And that was a pretty low point in my life. I was unemployed for about a year and a half, and talking to people and saying, I'm not suicidal, but I understand the feeling. I understand the idea of what's in the future and the hopelessness and the helplessness. And then I got hooked up with a behavioral health substance use treatment facility here in Pinellas County, Florida, called Operation PAR. And I was there for 12 and a half years. And I worked in research, outpatient, adolescent residential, and that's where I got my license. And then in 2019, I started the transition into full-time, into private practice.
Yeah, private practice. And it is amazing, Meredith. I never thought, I spent, and I tell people this all the time, I spent 23 years in law enforcement, retired in 2019. Of course, I went through my dark periods, which landed me in treatment, as you know, but I never thought I would be working. And I love it. I'm so blessed, but I never thought I'd be working in behavioral health, with treatment and trying to get, first responders, into treatment,
Oh yeah.
But it's amazing. I am so grateful. I am so satisfied. I love my job.
Mm-hmm.
If I can help, and I know you do, or you wouldn't be doing it. I mean, to help first responders who desperately need it, most of them, as you know, it's very hard. I mean, I'm speaking to the choir with you. I mean, it's very hard to get first responders to open up. And you have that unique background of being a cop and a clinician, so you can relate. Yeah. I know when I was going through, I didn't want to talk to anybody else, doctor, except somebody like you, who has the background, that knows the lingo, who knows what it's like to walk in those steps. So, and because you do that, you probably hear that all the time, right? They understand you more because you have that first responder background.
Yeah. And even as a law enforcement officer, I did a couple sessions with EAP because of some personal stuff I was going through. And while the EAP counselor was a very competent counselor, I just felt like this person doesn't understand my life.
No.
Where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
And I've had other agencies, when I've talked to agencies after, when I was getting into this, talking about how they've had EAP counselors, and I've heard this on other podcasts and other stories, that an EAP counselor breaking down crying.
That happened to me, Meredith.
Yeah. And now you have to be the service provider to pull them together.
So I finally reached out to help, reached out to my younger sister. I said, look, I have suicidal ideation. I have a plan, all that stuff. This is when I was in Colorado. So I went to a hospital. They got me checked in. Same thing happened. God bless her, this young woman comes in there and she ends up crying. And here I am, checking myself in for a hold, and she's getting upset.
Yeah.
It's not funny, but to your point, it's like, okay, I need somebody who understands.
Right. And I think that you're right. I think that gives me a unique perspective because,
absolutely.
I've had first responders, law enforcement officers come in and they're dropping F-bombs and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, I don't fucking care what you say. It's my language too. I get it. I understand the language, and I've had military people who've talked about, combat, and, we're out there picking up my buddy's body parts and putting them in a bag. And it's like, yeah, that sucks.
Now, is there any specialty, especially for the people that are listening and that are down in Florida right now, for you, Dr. Moran, is there any new specialties that are coming out? I mean, it seems like now the more I learn about it, there's, we talked a little bit, you can talk about ART. Where there are a lot of stuff is going on with like treatment of the brain, neurostimulation and neurofeedback and stuff. What's coming out? What do you foresee? I mean, you're in the field, the exciting new stuff now that's coming out for not just first responder therapy, but anybody who's struggling with addiction and mental health.
Yeah, EMDR is kind of a classic. It's been
like
around for a long time. Yeah. And I'm certified in an offshoot of EMDR called accelerated resolution therapy, ART. It does the same type of thing where we do the bilateral brain stimulation that simulates REM sleep. But I think and I've never done EMDR, but with ART, we can be a little bit more targeted. We can go, what is the thing that you want to work on? You know, my military client, he was like, yeah, I want to work on this IED issue where we had to do this stuff. And I'm like, okay, cool. Let's do that. And we go in and we strip the emotion away from the old memory, and then we rewrite a new memory into, when I talk to clients about emotional memory, I talk about it in terms of a Rolodex. And sometimes I have to explain to my young ones what a Rolodex is.
Yeah, for old people like us, you know, it was a little thing you
Yeah.
had on your desk, and you just kind of contact information.
Yeah. In my PowerPoint, when I train officers, I actually have a picture of a Rolodex, so I don't have to explain it to a whole room of people. But I talk about the emotional memory in terms of this Rolodex, that every emotional memory we've had from birth to right now is a card in that Rolodex.
Yeah. And
if we pull that card out, everything about the trauma, if it's a traumatic memory, is on that card. So with ART, what we can do is we can pull that card, that specific card out. We can strip the emotion away from the situation, and then we get to rewrite the card.
Oh, okay.
So now we get to say, what's a positive thing that you want to happen? You know, and I've had clients who were in a childhood abuse that they've gone in as their adult selves and rescued that child, or clients where they've had to deal with a suicide of a colleague, where they've gone in and they've rewritten it so that that person just quit their job and moved to a mountain in Montana and they're living their best life. And then we stick that new card into the Rolodex. And when you do that, when you change the picture, you change the emotional symptomology. So now even though my thinking brain knows what the truth is, and I've done ART with that, the shooting situation that you and I had talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I've done ART with that. So even though my thinking brain knows what really happened, my emotional brain has a different picture. So when I tell the story, I don't have the symptomology.
Wow. Yeah.
And yeah, it's amazing to watch.
How long do sessions generally last? I mean, I guess it depends on the patient, right? I mean,
usually an hour.
Okay.
I try not to go too far over an hour with an ART session. I had one that lasted 2 hours.
Yeah.
And he was a Minneapolis cop who was in the riots.
Oh, geez.
And so that session went really long. But yeah, that's the great thing about ART, is that depending on the trauma, we can get that taken care of in about an hour. You know, and then I tell clients, here's the thing, the brain's like an onion. So now that we've taken that layer off, other stuff might bubble up, and that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Write it down. We'll fix it next time.
Yeah.
Because that means your brain is saying, okay, I'm ready to deal with this. I'm ready to fix this.
Yeah. What do you think, Meredith? I mean, you treat first responders, a lot of them all the time. I mean, do you think that in the law enforcement, well, not just law enforcement, but the first responder field, you know, fire, EMS, LEOs, I mean, do you think the stigma is kind of eroding a little bit when, you know, first responders hear, you know, the term mental health or PTSI or PTSD, or do you think it just depends, you know, on the agency, or do you think that kind of stigma, like when I first started, you just didn't talk about your problems, you just didn't talk about the shit you were dealing with? But right. Do you think that, do you think it's, you know, it's getting better with the stigma behind mental health now, or do you think it's kind of the same?
Getting better? Yeah, I think it is getting better. Again, I think it is depending on the individual, depending on the agency. I just posted something on LinkedIn today. You've got to have a top-down approach
Absolutely.
to mental wellness. And you also have to have zero tolerance for suck it up attitudes.
Yeah, exactly. Those days are gone.
Yeah. Because anybody, if you've got 75% of your department on board with mental wellness, and you've got that one grizzly old sergeant or somebody, or that, retired on day shift guy that's like, I don't believe in this, just suck it up, then you're going to ruin it for everybody.
Yeah. That's why it's
And
so key. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, and I think you also have to have, this idea of, when I talk to supervisors, this idea of safety.
Yeah.
If the only time my supervisor talks to me is to tell me I've done something wrong, I'm not going to go to that supervisor and say, hey, I'm struggling.
Absolutely.
So, or if I see that John went to somebody and said, hey, I'm struggling, and they stripped him of his, they put him on the desk, put him in a hole somewhere and stripped him of his
You're penalizing
specialties.
him.
Yeah, they penalize him. Then there's no way that I'm going to speak up.
And I talk, when I talk to first responders, I would say 8 out of 10 that I speak to, and I don't know if you get this, Meredith, is where they say, we don't think that the brass has our back, or the higher ups, and that's the cause for a lot of their stress, and a lot of their depression, is we don't think, they think, in their minds, perception, maybe it's true, or maybe it's in perception is reality. We all know is that if they go out there and do something wrong, they're just going to be hung out to dry.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, I think with so many eyes on law enforcement today, and everybody's got a camera on their phone, and, there's this huge shift of, I don't know how quite to put this. There's this huge shift where everybody's got eyes on law enforcement. And so there is this, we've run into this danger of, even if I'm doing my job correctly, I could get eaten up in the media. I could get eaten up in my community, and my agency may jump on that just as a CYA for the agency. Yeah. So what's the point in me doing my job if I'm just going to get eaten up anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just so, I'm so glad, and I don't say this in a, arrogant way, hopefully. I mean, I'm so glad I got out when I did, but I'm also blessed. The flip side of that is I'm blessed that, or I'm happy, very happy that men and women are still getting into the field in this day and age, with so many, like you said, so many eyes, so much scrutiny. We've always had scrutiny, but I couldn't do the job now, Meredith. Yeah. I couldn't. And I not that I was out there doing legal shit, but I just couldn't. There's so much pressure on them today.
Yeah, I mean, when I was doing the job, even in the early 90s, you didn't have a 24/7 news cycle. Yeah, you didn't have. I can film you doing this thing, and it can be up on YouTube in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
You didn't have that.
But I still think, and maybe I'm just naive, I still think the vast majority of people out there support law enforcement, support first responders. Absolutely. I wish they were more vocal, but you think of, I tell people, and that, I mean, how many contacts do cops make on a daily basis? Hundreds of thousands of contacts. There's only a sliver, a very small percentage of those that go south. But those are the things that the media focuses on. Yeah. And some of them, the cops F up, that, they make stupid decisions, but majority of the time they're making the right decisions, in my opinion. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, we didn't have that news cycle when you and I were on the job. We have cameras. I remember when I started, we didn't even have laptops in the cars. We
didn't have laptops. I had a beeper. We didn't have laptops.
That's what I mean. We didn't have laptops in the car. We had, your laptop was your hand or your notepad or whatever.
Yeah.
And I remember beepers, and it was like people beep you. All right, call me.
Yeah, I would come home from work with notes all over you'd have to wash the notes off your hand. Or I remember going to a payphone and calling my dispatcher going, okay, call me on this number.
Yeah.
And my dispatcher would call me on a payphone so that we could have a private conversation, not over the radio.
I remember when I was at FTO for a while, and I remember I had this young officer in there, this cadet, and he gets in the car one day, and it's their job to fire up the car and make sure everything's okay. And I remember we get in there, and he's like, "Oh man, sir, the computer's not working." I was like, "Okay." Right? He's like, "Well, the laptop's not working." I was like, "Oh, okay." He's like, "Well, do I go home or what?" And I was like, "You see that thing right there? That's a radio. That's what you're going to use, all day. And you see that little thing in your pocket? That's a notebook." But he's like, I guess do I go home? Oh, sure. Yeah, we'll just shut down for the day.
Well, my husband's a sheriff's deputy, and he was saying that they were having problems with recruits backing into stuff because nobody knows how to use mirrors anymore to back
Or parallel
up.
park.
Or, well, I can't say that because I can't parallel park to save my life.
But we had young guys too, to your point, running in because we had beams, that would separate the carports.
Right.
And they would run, and there was a stupid design, but in their defense, but it was still, they didn't know how to back up.
Yeah. They didn't know how to use these guys. My husband's like, yeah, these guys are wrecking cruisers because they have no idea they're so used to that, the GPS backup camera that they have no idea how to use mirrors to back up.
I remember when I first started, I was in an old Caprice, or what are the old cop cars?
The Chevy Caprice.
Yeah, the Chevy Caprice, and then we had Impalas, and then we had what was the other one? The classic
we had Tauruses for a while. I had a Ford Taurus for a while.
Now I think I think everybody's driving an SUV.
Yeah.
Which but anyway, what advice, you did it for a long time. You're still, you got your toe in the water with first responders, you treat them. What advice would you give somebody out there who's thinking, I want to be not necessarily a cop, but I want to get into the first responder realm. I want to be a firefighter. I want to be a correction officer. What advice would you give them as a therapist?
I would say do your research. I would say talk to people, do a ride along if you can. I would say, I think, Kevin Gilmartin's Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. I think every recruit should read that. Yeah, I actually just gave it to a firefighter client that I have.
We had to read those. We had to read it. Our chief bought it for everybody in the department, and we had an assignment to do, which I think was awesome.
So yeah, I would say, yeah, read that book. Listen to podcasts like yours and a lot of the other law enforcement podcasts that are on that are telling the truth. And talk to people because it's a great job. I mean, there are days when I miss it. There are days, and I've been off the road since 1999.
Yeah.
Well, early 2000s, because I was a reserve deputy for a few years. But, it's a great job and it's fun, but it's also a job.
Yeah. It shouldn't consume your life.
When you get on, make sure you have that support system and that you keep that support system going.
Absolutely. And I tell people to get friends outside of law enforcement, Dr. Moran. I mean, I don't know that's what helped me too, as I started getting people outside of law enforcement to become friends with.
Yeah. Well, I think that we become, and I'm rereading Gilmartin's book because I'm getting ready to use it as a textbook for a class I'm going to be teaching in the spring. But I think we become this incestuous kind of thing because you get to the point where the only people who understand you are other cops.
The only people you trust are other cops.
And the only people you trust are other cops. As a female officer, when I first started, I was like, I'm not dating cops. I'm not dating them. I'm not marrying. I'm not doing anything like that. But then as a female officer dating in the civilian world, at least when I was doing it, you'd have two types of guys. Oh, you're a cop? You can kick my ass? Never mind. Or, so you have handcuffs, right? And this is what I'm dealing with. So I'm like, okay, I guess I'll date cops because I don't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
And I ended up marrying a cop. So, but
that's great advice.
It's really important to maintain those friendships and have those friendships outside of law enforcement, and also to have hobbies outside of law enforcement. One of the things I talk about is and going to the range is not a hobby.
No.
Going to the range is it's great. Go blow some rounds off, have a great time, but that is a skill set.
Well, yeah. When you say hobbies, I think of hiking or walking or playing golf or something where, and I don't get me, I love my guns, but I agree with you, Meredith. It's you're keeping up your skill set, because those are perishable skills if you don't keep up with them.
Yeah, but it's not a hobby.
Yeah,
it's do something that is not your job.
Yeah. What advice would you give anybody out there? Because statistically, people who are going to listen to this, there's a portion of them who are struggling. I mean, that's just a given. What advice would you give somebody out there who might be listening and hearing you as a doctor, as a therapist, as a clinician? What would you tell them if they're struggling right now?
I would tell them that that's a normal response to what you do.
Mm-hmm.
That you're probably, the problem is that people start to struggle and then they go, oh, I'm crazy.
Yeah.
And when I sit people in a chair and I tell them what trauma does to your brain and how it flips on that hyper alertness where you're just always in this state of hypervigilance, I've had people sit back in the chair and look at me and go, so I'm not crazy? I'm like, no, you're not crazy. You're just overstimulated. We can fix that.
Yeah.
So first of all, I would say the reactions that you're having are normal based on what you do for a living and what you see, but you need to offload that someplace. Mm-hmm. So find a trusted peer. If your agency or your county has a peer support team, find a trusted peer or somebody maybe in your family that you trust that you can offload that to, or find a culturally competent therapist.
Or reach out to you.
Or reach out to me. Yeah, if you're in the state of Florida, I do telehealth.
Yeah, so there you go.
If you're in the state of Florida, reach out to me and we'll talk. And I also believe that you don't have to be in crisis to go to therapy. Sometimes I have people who come in and go, I know what the answer is. I just need to vent. Or I have all this stuff, especially with first responders, I have all this stuff that I'm carrying. I don't want to traumatize my spouse with it. So I need to offload the really hard stuff so that then I can have conversations with my partner about my day and about how I'm feeling, but I don't traumatize them with the really, really ick stuff.
Yeah. But I like what you said. And I think of my own, stuff I went through. I didn't reach out until it was crisis mode. Mm-hmm. But I like what you said. You don't, even if you are starting to you don't have to wait till shit hits the fan.
Right.
It's like you can do improvement along the way to help mitigate that before, you're doing something stupid like trying to hurt yourself.
Yeah. Well, and I liken it to this idea of if you're on a call and it feels a little sketch, I'm going to call for backup before it goes completely south.
That's a good analogy. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, same thing with yourself.
Yeah. If you're feeling a type of way, go talk to somebody. And we can do, 2 sessions of this is what your brain's doing, and here's some tools to deal with it. And cool, peace out. Call me if you need me again.
Yeah.
Or we can do more sessions, whatever the client wants to do.
Preventative maintenance.
Yeah. And we do that with physical health all the time. You go to if you go to your doctor yearly for blood tests, you get your eyes checked, we do all of that stuff for our physical wellness, but we don't think about taking care of our mental wellness.
Absolutely.
On a preventative level.
And it all starts with the brain, I mean, it runs it all. But the good thing is that, your brain can heal itself, as you know.
Oh yeah. And I love neuroplasticity.
Yeah. Yeah. So Dr. Meredith Moran, where can people, again, listeners out there, if you're struggling and you're in the Florida area, please reach out to Dr. Moran. She's awesome. Where can they reach out to you?
So my website is, if you actually just Google Frontline Wellness, 2 words, you'll come across me, but it's flwellness.org. People can also call me. I have a direct cell line. 727-316-0798 is my direct office cell line. So people can call. If I don't answer, leave me a message. I try to get back to people within 24 hours, 24 to 48 hours, depending on if it's I do take my weekends off so I can have my own self-care.
Yeah, you need that, especially with your job.
Yeah.
You know, you need to take care of yourself too. You know that. So
Yeah.
you need some downtime.
Yeah. And if people go to my website, you can book a session straight off my website. You can book a free 30-minute consultation just straight off my website, either telehealth or in person, and we'll talk and see if we're a good fit.
Absolutely. Dr. Moran, thank you so much. For the listeners out there, everything we talked about, including Dr. Moran's contact information along with her cell and website, will be linked up in the show notes. Dr. Moran, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for your service. And thank you with your continuing service to our brave first responders who serve every day.
Thank you. And thank you for all that you do. You have helped me recently, and I appreciate you being there to help me with the stuff that I had going on with a client and all the stuff that you do. So
absolutely, my friend. Thank you so much. And yes, I mean, it takes a, it takes a collaboration with experts like you, and you just can't do it alone. It takes a team effort, with what we're dealing with, the crisis, I think, that's going on within the first responder community with, the mental health issues and the alcoholism and the other abuses that are happening. So, but reach out to Dr. Moran. She can help you get better.
I would love to.
All right, doctor. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'll talk with you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.
Thank you.